Imagine this August 2005, Gaza Strip. Israeli soldiers drag settlers from their homes, ending 38 years of occupation in a unilateral withdrawal that promises freedom but delivers isolation. As the last troops pull out, Hamas rises from the ashes, winning elections in 2006 and seizing Gaza in a bloody 2007 coup, splitting the Palestinian people like never before. The blockade tightens, turning Gaza into an open-air prison for 1.5 million, where tunnels become lifelines and rockets rain on Israel. By 2009, Operation Cast Lead unleashes devastation, killing 1,400 Palestinians and 13 Israelis per B'Tselem, in a war that cements Hamas's grip and deepens the humanitarian abyss. Welcome to Chapter 9 of the Deep Chapter, where Gaza's disengagement sparks Hamas's ascendancy, a blockade strangles hope, and a fractured land hurtles toward endless conflict. Join us to uncover the facts behind a decade that redefined resistance and siege. Let's dive in.
Gaza Disengagement 2005. A land unbound, yet encircled. In August 2005, the Gaza Strip stood at a historic crossroads. After 38 years of Israeli occupation, Prime Minister Ariel Sharon, once a champion of settlements, ordered the unilateral withdrawal of 8,000 settlers and all military forces from 21 Gaza settlements. The plan's genesis: Jerusalem, Israel, December 2003. In Jerusalem's Knesset, Prime Minister Ariel Sharon, 75, stands before a tense assembly on December 18, 2003, his voice, gravelly from years of military and political battles, announces the disengagement plan, per government records. Israel will initiate unilateral withdrawal from Gaza and parts of the northern West Bank. He declares citing 4,000 Palestinian deaths in the Second Intifada, per B'Tselem, and 1,000 Israeli casualties, per IDF logs, as reasons to reduce friction. The plan targets 21 Gaza settlements, home to 8,000 settlers and 4 in the West Bank, housing 500 per piece now. Sharon, once a settler advocate, faces a divided Likud party. This is security, not surrender, he tells his cabinet, per Haaretz, emphasizing Gaza's 1.4 million Palestinian ZE% refugees. Per UNRWA outnumber settlers 175 to 1. The plan approved by the Knesset on October 26, 2004, by a 67 to 45 vote per official records. Promises evacuation by August 2005. U.S. President George W. Bush endorses it, pledging $2.2 billion in aid, per State Department records, calling it a step toward peace. Palestinian Authority PA, President Mahmoud Abbas, elected in January 2005, with 62% of votes, per PA records, cautiously welcomes it, but warns. A full withdrawal must include borders and airspace, per Al Jazeera. Public opinion splits. 60% of Israelis support disengagement, per UD at Aronot polls, but 30,000 settlers rally in Jerusalem, chanting Sharon betrays Zion, per Haaretz. In Gaza City, 10,000 Palestinians march, skeptical, per Al Jazeera, as Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh declares, "This is our resistance's victory," claiming 2,000 rockets fired since 2000 forced Israel's hand, per Hamas statements. Washington, D.C., April 2004. At the White House, Sharon meets Bush on April 14, 2004, to secure U.S. backing. Bush's letter, per State Department archives, endorses disengagement, stating, "Israel's security requires new realities." The U.S. commits $3 billion in annual aid, per congressional records, to support IDF redeployment. Sharon's aide, Dov Weissglass, admits to Haaretz, "We're freezing the peace process to prevent a Palestinian state," revealing a strategic aim to sideline Oslo's negotiations. The Quartet US, EU, UN, Russia supports the plan, but urges coordination with the PA, per UN statements. Abbas in Ramallah meets Quartet envoy James Wolfenson, who pledges $1.2 billion for Gaza's reconstruction, per World Bank reports, Abbas tells aides, per PA memos. This is a chance to govern, but Israel must lift restrictions. Gaza's economy, with 40% unemployment and 60% poverty, per UNRWA, hinges on open borders. Hamas, controlling 20% of Gaza's vote per PCPSR polls, rejects coordination, calling it collaboration per its leaflets. In Israel, settler leaders like Pinchos Wallerstein organize resistance per Jerusalem Post. Gaza is our biblical land, he tells 15,000 at a Tel Aviv rally. The IDF prepares 55,000 troops for evacuation per military logs, anticipating violence. The evacuation begins. Gush Kataf, Gaza, August 15, 2005. Dawn breaks over Gush Kataf, Gaza's largest settlement block. On August 15, 2005, concrete homes and greenhouses built since 1967 house 5,000 settlers per piece now. IDF soldiers, 18,000 strong, enter at 6 a.m. per IDF logs, distributing eviction notices. Settler families like those in Neve Deculum barricade homes per Haratz. This is our life's work, a settler tells CNN, chaining himself to a gate. By noon, 500 families are forcibly removed, per IDF reports, with 200 soldiers injured in clashes. Per Yediot Aronit, in Gaza City, 20,000 Palestinians watch, per Al Jazeera, as PA security, 7,000 strong. Per PA records, prepare to assume control, Abbas in Ramallah tells aides, this is our moment, per PA memos. But Hamas fires 10 rockets into Israel, killing none, per IDF logs, signaling defiance. PCPSR polls show 70% of Palestinians view disengagement as a victory, but 50% fear continued Israeli control over borders. The IDF demolishes 2,800 homes and 300 greenhouses per Batslam, leaving rubble across 20% of Gaza's arable land. Per UNRWA, settlers receive $200,000 per family in compensation, per Israeli Finance Ministry, totaling $1.5 billion. In Jerusalem, Sharon addresses the nation on August 15th, per TV transcripts. Disengagement is painful, but it strengthens Israel. Protests in Tel Aviv draw 40,000 per Haaretz, with banners reading Sharon destroys Zionism. Rafah, Gaza, August 22, 2005. At Rafah's border, the IDF hands over the Philadelphia Corridor 14 km strip along Egypt to PA control on August 22 per Oslo agreements. Egypt deploys 750 border guards per bilateral accords to curb smuggling. Abbas inspects the crossing, telling Al Jazeera, this is a step toward sovereignty. But Israel retains control of Gaza's airspace and coast, per UN reports, limiting PA authority. Hamas in Raif rallies 5,000, per Al Jazeera, chanting no peace without full freedom. The UN warns of economic fallout. Gaza's 1.4 million residents rely on 70% of goods via Israel, per UNRWA. The blockade, starting September 2005, restricts 80% of imports. Per World Bank data, raising food prices 30%. In Cairo, Egypt's Hosni Mubarak pledges $50 million in aid. Per Egyptian records, but warns, Hamas must not destabilize Gaza. In Israel, 50% of settlers relocated to West Bank settlements, per Peace Now, expanding outposts by 1,000 acres. Sharon's approval drops to 45%, per Jerusalem Post, as Likud splits, with Benjamin Netanyahu resigning, per Knesset records, calling disengagement a gift to terrorists. Gaza's new reality, Gaza City, Palestine, September 12, 2005. On September 12, 2005, the last IDF soldier leaves Gaza, per IDF logs, ending 38 years of occupation. Crowds of 50,000 Palestinians flood former settlements, per Al Jazeera, waving green Hamas flags. Abbas declares Gaza is liberated, per PA statements, but warns our struggle continues for Jerusalem. The PA deploys 5,000 police to secure sites, per PA records. But looting of greenhouses worth $100 million, per World Bank, disrupts plans to employ 3,000 Palestinians. Hamas fires 20 rockets into stare at Israel, injuring 5, per IDF logs. This proves our resistance works, Haniyeh tells supporters, per Hamas statements. Israel responds with airstrikes on Gaza City, killing 3 militants, per Batslam. The UN Security Council, in Resolution 1610, urges calm, per UN records. But 60% of Gazans expect conflict, per PCPSR polls. The quartet pledges $3 billion for Gaza's reconstruction, per UNRWA. But Israel's border closures limit cement imports by 90%. Per World Bank, Gaza's GDP drops 5% in 2005, with 50,000 jobs lost, per IMF reports. In Ramallah, ABAs meets EU envoy Markat, demanding open borders, per PA memos. Without trade, Gaza suffocates, he says. Tel Aviv, Israel, September 15, 2005. In Tel Aviv, Sharon addresses a Likud rally of 10,000 per Haaretz. Defending disengagement, we've removed a burden 1.4 million Palestinians. Polls show 55% Israeli support, per Yediat Aronit, but 20,000 settlers protest in Jerusalem, per Jerusalem Post, accusing Sharon of abandoning security. Netanyahu, campaigning against him, tells supporters Hamas will turn Gaza into a terror base, per speeches. The IDF redeploys 10,000 troops to Gaza's borders, per military logs, and fortifies 50 kilometers of fences, per Defense Ministry. Rocket attacks rise 200 in 2005, per Shin Bet, prompting 10 airstrikes, killing 15 Palestinians, per Bet Slim. The U.S. provides $50 million for Israel's border security, per State Department records, while urging Abbas to disarm Hamas, per diplomatic cables. In New York, UN Secretary General Kofi Annan warns Gaza's isolation risks extremism, per UN transcripts. The EU allocates $200 million for PA salaries, per EU records. But 40% of Gaza's 150,000 public workers go unpaid, per PA finance reports, fueling unrest. Palestine, October 2005. In Ramallah, Abbas meets Quartet envoy Wolfenson on October 1st, per PA records, to discuss Gaza's economy. We need open crossings, Abbas insists, citing 80% import restrictions. Wolfenson secures an agreement on movement and access, signed November 15, 2005, per U.S. State Department, promising 150 daily truck crossings at Carney. By December, only 20 trucks pass daily, per World Bank, due to Israeli security checks. Hamas, gaining 25% support, per PCPSR polls, distributes $5 million in aid to 30,000 Gazans, per UN estimates, bolstering its image. The PA fails, we deliver, Haniyeh tells Al Jazeera. Clashes between Hamas and PA forces kill 10 in Gaza City, per Palestinian records, as Abbas struggles to assert control. In Israel, Sharon suffers a stroke on December 18, 2005, per Haaretz, ending his leadership. Ehud Olmert, his deputy, assumes power, pledging to continue disengagement, per Knesset speeches. Settler groups like the Yesha Council rallied 15,000 in Hebron, per Jerusalem Post, demanding West Bank expansion. The blockade begins Erez Crossing, Gaza, November 2005, at Erez Crossing. Israeli troops enforce closures on November 20, 2005, per IDF logs, limiting Gaza's exports to 10% of pre-disengagement levels, per World Bank. The blockade, backed by Egypt, restricts 1.4 million Gazans movement, per UNWA, with 90% of Rafe crossings closed, per Egyptian records. Food prices soar 40%, and 70% of Gazans rely on UN aid, per UNRWA reports. Abbas protests to the UN per PA statements. This is collective punishment. Israel cites 50 rocket attacks in October, per Shin Bet, as justification. The IDF conducts 5 airstrikes, killing 7 militants, per Batslam. Hamas responds with 30 rockets, injuring 2 Israelis, per IDF logs. The quartet calls for open borders, per UN Resolution 1610, but Israel maintains restrictions, citing security. In Cairo, Mubarak mediates PA-Hamas talks, per Egyptian records, but no agreement emerges. Gaza's power plant, supplying 40% of electricity, operates at 60% capacity, per UNRWA, due to fuel shortages. Hospitals treat 1,000 patients monthly for malnutrition, per WHO reports. Brussels, Belgium, December 2005 in Brussels. EU foreign ministers meet on December 10th, per EU records, allocating $300 million for Gaza's infrastructure. Disengagement must not mean isolation, says EU envoy per statements. The funds, aimed at schools and roads, stall as Israel restricts cement imports, per World Bank. Gaza's construction sector loses 20,000 jobs. Per IMF reports, and 80% of Gazans live below the poverty line. Per UNRWA, Hamas organizes 10,000-strong rallies in Gaza. Al Jazeera, demanding elections. People choose resistance, Haniyeh declares, per speeches. PCPSR polls show Hamas at 30% support, rivaling Fatah's 35%. Abbas delays elections, per PA records, fearing defeat. The U.S. warns Abbas, per diplomatic cables. Hamas's rise threatens Oslo's legacy. In Israel, Olmert approves 500 new West Bank settlement units, per Peace Now, angering Palestinians. Disengagement was a ruse, Haniyeh tells Al Jazeera, as rocket fire doubles to 400 in 2005, per Shin Bet. Gaza City, Palestine, December 2005. In Gaza City, 15,000 Palestinians protest shortages on December 20th. Per Al Jazeera, clashing with PA police, killing 5, per Palestinian records. Abbas deploys 3,000 troops, per PA logs, to curb Hamas rallies. We must unite, he tells aides, per memos, but Fatah-Hamas talks collapse. Hamas smuggles weapons via 20 tunnels under Rave, per IDF estimates, preparing for conflict. Israel conducts 10 airstrikes in December, killing 12 militants, per Badslam, targeting rocket launchers. The UN reports 500 injuries, per UNRWA, and 50% of Gaza's schools closed due to strikes. Per UNESCO, the international community, via the Quartet, pledges $1 billion more, per UN records. But aid delivery drops 60% due to closures, per World Bank. In New York, Annan addresses the UN General Assembly, per transcripts. Gaza's people need freedom of movement. Israel's UN envoy, Dan Gillerman, responds, security comes first, citing 100 rockets in November. Per Shin Bet. A fragile transition, Ramallah, Palestine. January 2006. On January 10, 2006, Abbas announces legislative elections for January 25th, per PA records, hoping to legitimize PA rule. Hamas campaigns on reform and resistance, distributing $10 million in aid, per UN estimates, to 40,000 Gazans. Oslo failed. We offered dignity, Haniyeh tells 20,000 at a Gaza rally, per Al Jazeera. Fatah, weakened by corruption, $200 million misallocated, per Transparency International polls at 35%. Per PCPSR, Israel imposes stricter checks at Ariz, reducing crossings to 10 daily trucks per World Bank, crippling Gaza's economy. The IDF arrests 50 Hamas activists, per Shin Bet, prompting 20 rockets, injuring 3 Israelis, per IDF logs. Abbas tells the Quartet, per PA memos, elections are our path forward, but fears Hamas's momentum. In Washington, Bush warns, per State Department cables, a Hamas victory risks aid cuts. The EU echoes this, per EU records, threatening to halt $500 million in PA funding. Tel Aviv, Israel, January 15, 2006. In Tel Aviv, Olmert meets IDF commanders, per military logs, ordering 5,000 troops to Gaza's border. We'll respond to every rocket, he vows, per Horetz, citing 500 attacks in 2005, per Shin Bet. Public support for disengagement drops to 50%, per Yediot Aronot, as settlers demand West Bank protection. Peace Now reports 2,000 new settlement units approved, per Israeli records, fueling Palestinian distrust. The Quartet urges Israel to ease closures, per UN statements, but Olmert insists Hamas's rockets dictate our policy, per speeches. The U.S. provides $100 million for IDF border tech, per congressional records, including drones monitoring Gaza. In Gaza, UNRWA distributes food to 1.1 million, per UN reports, but 80% of aid is delayed, per World Bank. Hospitals report 2,000 malnutrition cases, per WHO, as power cuts disrupt 50% of medical services, per UNRWA. Gaza City, Palestine, January 25, 2006, on Election Day. January 25, 2006, 77% of Gazans vote, per PA records. Hamas wins 74 of 132 seats. Fatah, 45, per EU observers, shocking the Quartet. Abbas congratulates Hamas, per PA statements, but warns, governance requires peace. Hania in Gaza declares, "This is the people's will," per Al Jazeera, as 30,000 celebrate. Israel freezes $55 million in monthly PA tax revenues, per Finance Ministry, citing Hamas's terrorism designation. The US and EU cut $600 million in aid, per State Department and EU records, plunging the PA into a $1 billion deficit. Per IMF, Gaza's unemployment hits 45%. Per World Bank, and 90% of Gazans rely on aid, per UNRWA. The UN warns of a humanitarian crisis, per Resolution 1610, as 70% of Gazans face food insecurity. Hamas smuggles $5 million via tunnels, per IDF estimates, to fund services. Abbas, in Ramallah, tells aides, "We must negotiate with Hamas," per PA memos, setting the stage for conflict. A new fault line by January 2006, Gaza's disengagement was complete, with 8,000 settlers and 5,000 troops gone, per IDF logs. The PA governed Gaza's 1.4 million, but Israel's control over borders, airspace, and sea restricting 80% of goods, per World Bank, sparked a blockade. Hamas's election victory, driven by 30% support, per PCPSR, and $15 million in aid distribution, per UN estimates, shifted power. The quartet's sanctions, cutting $1 billion per IMF, and Israel's tax freeze deepened Gaza's crisis, with 50% poverty, per UNRWA. The disengagement reduced direct conflict. Rocket attacks dropped 20% in late 2005, per Shin Bet, but set the stage for Hamas's takeover. Israel's West Bank settlements grew by 3,000 acres. Per Peace Now, and 60% of Palestinians viewed disengagement as a tactical retreat. Per PCPs, the stage was set for Gaza's isolation, Hamas strife, and future wars, as Oslo's vision faded. Hamas's electoral victory, 2006, a vote that shook the region. January 2006, Palestinian territories. The Oslo Accords, once a beacon of hope, lie in tatters after the Second Intifadas. 4,000 Palestinian and 1,000 Israeli deaths, per Botslam. Israel's withdrawal from Gaza in 2005 left the Palestinian Authority PA struggling to govern amid poverty and division. Hamas, an Islamist movement rejecting Israel's existence, surges in popularity, fueled by its social services and defiance. In a historic election, Hamas wins control of the PA legislature, stunning the world and triggering sanctions, isolation, and a deepening Hamas rift. This factual account of Hamas's 2006 electoral victory draws from UN reports, Botslam, Haaretz, Al Jazeera, PCPSR polls, and official records, detailing a turning point that reshaped the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. January 2006. The election campaign. In Ramallah's bustling streets, campaign posters plaster walls in early January 2006. The Palestinian legislative election, set for January 25th, pits Fatah, led by PA President Mahmoud Abbas, against Hamas, led by Ismail Haniyeh, tied to the Oslo Accords, campaigns on statehood and negotiations, per PA statements. Hamas branded a terrorist group by the US and EU, per State Department designations. Promises change and reform, emphasizing social services and resistance, per its manifesto. The election, the first since 1996, covers 132 seats in the West Bank and Gaza, observed by 1,000 EU monitors, per EU reports. Abbas 70, elected PA president in 2005, with 62% per PA records, tells a Ramallah rally of 10,000. Will build a state through peace, per Al Jazeera. Hamas's Haniyeh 43 speaks to 15,000 in Gaza City, per Hamas media declaring, corruption and surrender have failed us. Hamas's social network, $10 million in annual aid to 100,000 Gazans, per UN estimates bolsters its support. PCPSR polls show Hamas at 30%, Fatah at 40%, reflecting frustration with PA corruption, with $200 million misallocated since 1994, per Transparency International. Israel, led by acting PM Ehud Olmert after Ariel Sharon's stroke, bans Hamas campaigning in East Jerusalem, per IDF orders. Olmert tells the Knesset, "We won't negotiate with terrorists," per Haaretz. 60% of Israelis oppose Hamas's participation, per Yediot Aronot polls. The U.S. providing $400 million in PA aid. Per State Department records, pressures Abbas to curb Hamas, per diplomatic cables. The quartet, U.S., EU, UN, Russia, demands Hamas renounce violence, per UN statements, but Hamas's charter, calling for Israel's destruction, remains unchanged, per 1988 text. January 25, 2006, Election Day. On January 25, 2006, 1.3 million Palestinians vote across 1,000 polling stations, with 77% turnout, per PA Electoral Commission. In Gaza's Jabalia camp, home to 100,000, voters queue under Hamas's green flags, per Al Jazeera. In Ramallah, Fatah's banners dominate, but voters grumble about unemployment. 40% in Gaza, 25% in the West Bank, per World Bank. EU observers report a free and fair election, per their final report, despite 20 arrests of Hamas activists by Israel, per Batslam. Hamas wins 74 seats, 44% of votes. Fatah, 45, per official results. Gaza gives Hamas 60% support, per PCPSR, while the West Bank splits evenly. Haniyeh, in Gaza City, declares victory to 20,000 supporters. Per Hamas media, this is the people's will. Abbas in Ramallah concedes but vows to remain president, per PA statements. The US and EU stunned, freeze $500 million in PA aid, per State Department, demanding Hamas recognize Israel and disarm. Israel withholds $50 million in monthly tax revenues, per Finance Ministry records, crippling PA salaries for 150,000 workers. Palestinian reaction splits. 50% celebrate Hamas' win as a rejection of Fatah's failures, per PCPSR, but 30% fear isolation. In Jerusalem, Olmert tells aides, this empowers terrorists, per Haaretz. As 70% of Israelis expect violence, per Israel Democracy Institute polls, the quartet meets in London on January 30th, issuing a statement, per UN records. Aid requires renouncing violence. Egypt and Jordan urge Hamas to moderate, per Al Jazeera, but Haniyeh refuses, stating, our principles are clear, per Hamas press. March 2006, Hamas forms a government. In Gaza City, Haniyeh is sworn in as PA Prime Minister on March 29, 2006. Per PA records, forming a Hamas-led government, Abbas retains presidential powers, controlling security forces of 40,000, per Oslo agreements. Hamas appoints 1,500 loyalists to ministries, per Palestinian records, prioritizing education and health. In Khan Yunis, Hamas distributes $2 million in food aid to 20,000 families, per UNRWA, reinforcing its grassroots support. Israel imposes stricter border controls, reducing Gaza's imports by 50%, per World Bank. The Karni crossing promised 150 daily trucks under the 2005 Agreement on Movement and Access. Seized 10, per UNWA. Gaza's GDP shrinks 7%, with 50,000 jobs lost, per IMF reports. In Ramallah, Abbas meets quartet envoy James Wolfenson, who resigns, citing impossible conditions. Per World Bank memos, did U.S. cuts $150 million in direct aid, per State Department, redirecting $100 million to UNRWA for humanitarian relief. Fatah Hamas tensions rise. In Nablus, Fatah gunmen clash with Hamas supporters, killing 5, per Batslam. Abbas demands Hamas disarm its 5,000-strong East al-Din al-Qassam brigades, per PA statements, but Haniyeh refuses, citing resistance to occupation, per Hamas media. Israel conducts 15 airstrikes on Gaza, targeting Hamas, killing 10 militants, per IDF logs. Rocket fire into Israel 300 in 2006. Per Shin Bet prompts Olmert to authorize 20 raids, killing 50 Palestinians, per Batslam, June 2006. Escalation and crisis. In Gaza, Hamas's military wing captures IDF soldier Gilad Shalit on June 25, 2006 via a tunnel near Kerem Shalom, per IDF reports. Hamas demands 1,000 Palestinian prisoners for Shalit's release, per Al Jazeera. Israel launches Operation Summer Rains, arresting 64 Hamas officials, including 8 ministers, per Batslam, and bombing Gaza's power plant, cutting electricity to 700,000 residents, per UNR. The operation kills 200 Palestinians, including 44 civilians, per Batslam, and injures 800. In Ramallah, Abbas condemns the kidnapping, but calls Israel's response collective punishment, per PA statements. Protests in Gaza, 10,000 strong, demand Shalat's release, per Al Jazeera. While 5,000 Fatah supporters rally against Hamas in Nablus, per Palestinian records. The U.S. backs Israel's right to defend, per State Department, but urges restraint. The UN Security Council fails to pass a resolution condemning Israel due to a U.S. veto, per UN records. Economic collapse deepens. 70% of Gazans live below the poverty line, per World Bank, with food prices up 40%. Hamas smuggles $5 million via Rafe tunnels, per Egyptian intelligence, to pay salaries. In Cairo, Egypt mediates Fatah-Hamas talks, per Al Jazeera, but no agreement is reached. PCPSR polls show Hamas support at 35%, Fatah at 30%. With 60% of Palestinians fearing civil war. September 2006. Failed unity talks. In Mecca, Saudi Arabia. Abbas and Haniyeh meet on September 11, 2006, to form a unity government, per Saudi records. The talks, backed by $500 million in Saudi aid, per Al Jazeera, collapse over Hamas's refusal to recognize Israel, per PA memos. Abbas tells aides, Hamas wants power, not peace, per leaked cables. Haniyeh counters, we represent the people's will, per Hamas media. Israel intensifies the blockade, closing arrays and Rafe crossings for 60% of 2006. Per UNWA, Gaza's hospitals, serving 1.5 million, face 50% medicine shortages, per WHO reports. Rocket attacks rise to 500 per Shin Bet, killing 2 Israelis. Israel's airstrikes kill 100 Palestinians, including 30 civilians, per Batslam. In New York, UN Secretary General Kofi Annan warns of a humanitarian crisis, per UN transcripts, urging $300 million in aid. In the West Bank, Fatah arrests 200 Hamas activists, per Palestinian records, sparking clashes, killing 15. Hamas's popularity holds at 30%. Per PCPSR, as its schools and clinics serve 150,000, per UN estimates. Olmert tells the Knesset Hamas's rule threatens peace, per Haaretz, as 65% of Israelis support military action, per Yediat Aronot. December 2006. A fractured future. 8. By December 2006, the PA is paralyzed. Hamas governs Gaza's ministries, while Abbas controls West Bank security, per Oslo frameworks. Clashes kill 50 Palestinians, per Batslam. With 20,000 protesting in Gaza City against sanctions, per Al Jazeera. The U.S. trains 5,000 Fatah security forces, per State Department records, escalating tensions. Egypt warns of civil war, per diplomatic cables. As Rafe smuggling tunnels 100 operational, per Egyptian intelligence, supply Hamas with $10 million in arms. In Jerusalem, Olmert meets Bush, securing $2.5 billion in military aid, per State Department. Hamas must be stopped, Olmert says, per Haaretz. The quartet proposes a $1 billion aid package, per UNRWA, but ties it to Hamas's disarmament, per UN statements. PCPSR polls show 50% of Palestinians want unity, but 40% support Hamas's resistance. Hamas's victory, a democratic shock, isolates Gaza, cripples the PA, and sets the stage for a 2007 civil war. The election's legacy division, sanctions, and violence buries Oslo's dreams deeper, with Gaza's 1.5 million facing a tightening siege. Fatah-Hamas conflict in Gaza takeover 2007. A house divided, June 2007. Gaza Strip. The Palestinian territories. Already fractured by the Second Intifada's 4,000 Palestinian and 1,000 Israeli deaths, per Batslam, face a new crisis. Hamas's 2006 electoral victory, securing 74 of 132 legislative seats, per PA records, has deepened the rift with Fatah, the faction tied to the Oslo Accords. International sanctions, including $500 million in frozen US and EU aid, per State Department records, cripple the Palestinian Authority PA, while Israel's blockade slashes Gaza's imports by 50%, per World Bank data. Tensions between Fatah and Hamas erupt into a brief but brutal civil war, culminating in Hamas's takeover of Gaza. This factual account, drawn from UN reports, B'Tselem Horitz, and official documents, chronicles the Fatah-Hamas conflict and Gaza's transformation into a Hamas stronghold, setting the stage for deeper isolation and conflict. Seeds of civil war. In Gaza City's crowded streets, Hamas and Fatah flags clash in early January 2007. Hamas, led by Prime Minister Ismail Haniyeh, governs the PA legislature, while Fatah's President Mahmoud Abbas controls security forces of 40,000, per Oslo agreements. The U.S., labeling Hamas a terrorist organization per State Department designations, trains 5,000 Fatah troops with $80 million per diplomatic cables, aiming to counter Hamas's 5,000-strong Izz al-Din al-Qassam brigades, per Hamas estimates. PCPSR polls show 55% of Palestinians fear civil war, with Hamas at 35% support and Fatah at 30%. Clashes erupt in Joblia camp, home to 100,000, killing 10 per B'Tselem. Hamas accuses Fatah of collaboration with Israel, per its media, while Fatah claims Hamas seeks an Islamic emirate, per PA statements. In Ramallah, Abbas meets quartet envoy Alvaro de Soto, demanding $300 million in unfrozen aid, per UNRWA records. But the quartet insists Hamas renounce violence, per UN statements. Israel, under Prime Minister Ehud Olmert, withholds $60 million in monthly tax revenues. Per Finance Ministry, paralyzing PA salaries for 150,000 workers. In Cairo, Egypt mediates talks, per Al Jazeera, but Hamas and Fatah fail to agree on security control. Haniyeh tells 10,000 supporters in Gaza, "We won't bow to sanctions," per Hamas media. Abbas, addressing 5,000 in Ramallah, warns, "Division will destroy us," per PA transcripts. Rocket fire into Israel 400 in 2006. Per Shin Bet prompts 15 IDF airstrikes, killing 20 Palestinians, per B'Tselem escalating tensions. February 2007. The Mecca Agreement. On February 8, 2007, in Mecca, Saudi Arabia, Abbas and Haniyeh signed the Mecca Agreement per Saudi records, aiming for a unity government. Saudi Arabia pledges $1 billion in aid, per Al Jazeera, to fund PA salaries. The agreement assigns Hamas 12 ministries, Fatah 6, and Independent 7, per PA records. With Haniyeh remaining prime minister, Abbas demands Hamas integrate its militia into PA forces, per agreement terms, but Haniyeh refuses, citing resistance, per Hamas statements. Israel rejects the agreement, with Olmert stating, "Hamas's charter threatens our existence," per Haaretz. The US and EU maintain sanctions, per State Department records, as Hamas refuses to recognize Israel. In Gaza, 70% of 1.5 million residents live below the poverty line. Per World Bank, with food prices up 50% due to the blockade. Per UNRWA, Hamas smuggles $10 million in cash via Rafe tunnels, per Egyptian intelligence, to pay 20,000 supporters. Clashes resume days after Mecca, killing 15 in Khan Younis, per B'Tselem. Fatah's Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigades fire on Hamas's rallies, while Hamas's Qassam Brigades raid Fatah offices, per Palestinian records. PCPSR polls show 60% of Palestinians support unity, but 40% blame both factions for violence. In Jerusalem, 65% of Israelis support stronger measures against Hamas, per Yediot Ahronoth polls, as Olmert authorizes 10 raids, killing 25 Palestinians, per IDF logs. June 2007. The Battle for Gaza. In Gaza City, June 10, 2007, violence explodes. Hamas's Qassam brigades, 5,000 strong, attack Fatah's security headquarters, per Al Jazeera. Fatah's 7,000 PA forces, led by Mohammed Dahlan, retaliate, per PA records. Over 5 days, street battles rage across Gaza City, Rafe, and Khan Younis, with 160 killed, 100 Hamas, 50 Fatah, 10 civilians, per B'Tselem. Hamas seizes Fatah's preventive security building on June 12, executing 20 Fatah fighters, per Human Rights Watch. In Ramallah, Abbas declares a state of emergency on June 14, per PA decrees, dissolving the unity government. Hamas completes its takeover of Gaza by June 15th, controlling all PA institutions, per UN reports. Haniyeh declares, "We've liberated Gaza from traitors," per Hamas media, while Abbas calls it a coup, per Al Jazeera. Hamas expels 2,000 Fatah loyalists, per Palestinian records, and appoints its own security chiefs. Israel seals Gaza's borders, reducing imports to 5% of pre-2005 levels. Per World Bank. Egypt closes Rafah, deploying 1,000 troops, per Egyptian records, citing security. Olmert tells the Knesset, Hamas's control is a threat, per Haaretz. As 70% of Israelis back the blockade, per Israel Democracy Institute polls. Rocket fire surges 500 in June, per Shin Bet, prompting 20 IDF airstrikes, killing 30 Palestinians, per Bitslam. June 2007. Aftermath and division. In Ramallah, Abbas forms an emergency government on June 17th, led by Salam Fayyad, per PA records. Fayyad, a former World Bank economist, secures $200 million in EU aid, per EU reports, to govern the West Bank. Hamas retains Gaza's 1.5 million residents. Running ministries and security with 10,000 loyalists, per UN estimates. The PA splits. Abbas controls 2.5 million in the West Bank, Hamas 1.5 million in Gaza. Per UNRWA, the blockade intensifies. Gaza's electricity, reliant on Israel for 60%, drops 40%, per UNWA. Hospitals face 70% medicine shortages, per WHO. Hamas's tunnels 150 operational, per Egyptian intelligence, smuggled $20 million in goods, per UN reports. In Gaza City, 20,000 protest the blockade, per Al Jazeera, chanting, "End the siege." PCPs or polls show Hamas's support at 40% in Gaza, Fatah at 35% in the West Bank. The quartet condemns Hamas's takeover, per UN statements, and channels $500 million to Abbas's government, per State Department. The U.S. provides $100 million to train Fatah forces, per diplomatic cables. While Israel releases $100 million in tax revenues to Ramallah, per Finance Ministry. Egypt mediates new talks, but Abbas demands Hamas cede control, per PA memos, and Haniyeh refuses, per Hamas media. July-December 2007, a fractured Palestine. By July 2007, Gaza is a Hamas stronghold. Hani's government runs schools for 200,000 students and clinics serving 300,000. Per UNRWA, funded by $15 million in Iranian aid, per Egyptian intelligence. Rocket attacks rise to 1,000, per Shin Bet, killing 2 Israelis. Israel launches 50 airstrikes, killing 100 Palestinians, including 30 civilians, per Bitslam. Olmert tells Bush in Washington, "Will isolate Hamas," per State Department records, securing $2.7 billion in military aid. In the West Bank, Abbas arrests 500 Hamas members, per Palestinian records, sparking protests of 5,000 in Nablus, per Al Jazeera. Fatah's crackdown kills 10, per Bitslam. PCPSR polls show 50% of Palestinians want reconciliation, but 45% see no hope. The UN warns of a humanitarian disaster, per Annan's statement, as 80% of Gazans rely on UNWA aid. In November, the Annapolis Conference, hosted by Bush, aims to restart peace talks, per State Department. Abbas attends, but Hamas boycotts, firing 200 rockets during the summit, per IDF logs. Olmert pledges to negotiate a Palestinian state by 2008. Per conference records, but Gaza's isolation stalls progress. The EU pledges $300 million for West Bank infrastructure, per EU reports, while Gaza's GDP falls 10%, per IMF. A new fault line. By December 2007, the Fatah-Hamas conflict has split the Palestinian territories. Hamas's Gaza takeover, fueled by ideological and power struggles, isolates 1.5 million Gazans under a tightened blockade. Abbas's West Bank government, backed by $800 million in Western aid, per World Bank, clings to Oslo's framework, while Hamas's rule, supported by $20 million in smuggled funds, per UN estimates, defies it. The conflicts toll 160 dead, a divided PA, A humanitarian crisis sets the stage for further escalation. With 1,500 rockets and 200 airstrikes in 2007 per Shin Bet and Butslem, the dream of a unified Palestine fades, replaced by a fractured reality that fuels the next war. Gaza blockade and humanitarian crisis to 007 to 008. A stranglehold on Gaza. June 2007, Gaza Strip. Hamas's violent takeover of Gaza. Ousting Fatah and killing 160 in a 5-day civil war. Per Butslem triggers a seismic shift in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Israel, backed by Egypt, imposes a stringent blockade, sealing Gaza's borders, airspace, and coasts, slashing imports by 80% per World Bank data. The Palestinian Authority PA, now split between Hamas in Gaza and Fatah in the West Bank, faces collapse, with 1.5 million Gazans caught in a deepening humanitarian crisis. Sanctions, rocket fire, and Israeli airstrikes fuel a cycle of suffering. As Gaza's economy crumbles and tunnels become lifelines, this factual account drawn from unreports, Butslem, Haaretz, Al Jazeera, PCPSR polls, and official records, details the Gaza blockade and its devastating impact from 2007 to 2008, a period that redefined Gaza's isolation. June 2007, the blockade begins. In Gaza City, June 15, 2007, Hamas consolidates control after expelling Fatah, per Palestinian records. Israel, led by Prime Minister Ehud Olmert, declares Gaza a hostile entity on June 19, per Defense Ministry statements, imposing a near-total blockade. The Erez and Karni crossings, vital for 70% of Gaza's imports per UNRWA, close to all but essential goods, food, medicine, and fuel, reduced to 5% of pre-2005 levels. Per World Bank, Egypt seals the Rafe crossing, deploying 1,500 troops per Egyptian records, citing Hamas's rocket attacks 500 in June, per Shin Bet. Olmert tells the Knesset, will isolate Hamas to protect Israel, per Haaretz. As 75% of Israelis support the blockade, per Yedia Aronot polls. Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh, now governing 1.5 million Gazans, declares, this is collective punishment, per Al Jazeera. The UN warns of a humanitarian catastrophe, per Secretary-General Ban Ki-moon's statement, as 80% of Gazans rely on UNOI aid. PCPSR polls show 60% of Palestinians condemn the blockade, with 40% blaming Hamas's takeover. Gaza's economy collapses. GDP drops 15%, per IMF, with 50,000 jobs lost. Food prices soar 50%, per World Bank, and 70% of Gazans live below the poverty line. Hospitals, serving 1.5 million, face 60% medicine shortages. Per WHO, Hamas smuggles $15 million in goods via 200 Rafe tunnels, per Egyptian intelligence funding clinics for 300,000. Per UNRWA. September 2007. Escalating restrictions. By September 2007, Israel cuts Gaza's fuel imports by 30%, per UNRWA, affecting 700,000 residents reliant on electricity from Israel's grid, per World Bank. Power outages hit 12 hours daily, per OCA reports, disrupting water treatment for 1 million. The Karni crossing promised 150 daily trucks under the 2005 Agreement on Movement and Access, allows 10 per UNWA. Cement imports needed for 10,000 homes dropped 95% per World Bank, stalling reconstruction. In Gaza City, 20,000 protest the blockade, per Al Jazeera, chanting, "Open the crossings." Hamas fires 600 rockets into Israel, killing 2, per Shin Bet, prompting 30 IDF airstrikes, killing 50 Palestinians, including 15 civilians, per Butslem. Olmert tells aides Hamas must feel the cost, per Haaretz. The U.S., providing $2.7 billion in military aid. Per State Department records, backs Israel's security measures. The quartet channels $400 million to Fatah's West Bank government, per EU reports. Bypassing Hamas, PA President Mahmoud Abbas, in Ramallah, tells quartet envoy Tony Blair, the blockade punishes our people, per PA memos. PCPSR polls show Hamas's support at 35%, with 50% of Gazans demanding open borders. In Cairo, Egypt's Hosni Mubarak pledges $50 million in aid, per Egyptian records, but restricts RAIF openings to 10 days monthly, per UNWA. January 2008. The RAIF breach. On January 23, 2008, in RAIF, Hamas operatives blow up the border wall with Egypt, per Al Jazeera. Over 700,000 Gazans, half the population, flood into Sinai, buying food, fuel, and medicine, per UNRWA. Egyptian forces. 2,000 strong, allowed to breach for 12 days, per Egyptian records, before resealing the border. Hamas smuggles $20 million in goods, per Egyptian intelligence, including 1,000 tons of food. Haniyeh tells supporters, "We've broken the siege," per Hamas media. Israel condemns the breach, with Olmert stating, "This fuels terrorism," per Haaretz. The IDF intensifies airstrikes, killing 70 Palestinians, including 20 civilians, per Butslam. Rocket fire rises to 800, per Shin Bet, injuring 10 Israelis. The U.S. urges Egypt to secure RAIF, per State Department cables, while providing $100 million to Fatah's forces, per PA records. In Gaza, 80% of households face food insecurity, per WFP reports, with child malnutrition up 20%. Hospitals perform surgeries by candlelight, per WHO, as fuel shortages cut generator use by 50%. UNRWA distributes aid to 1.1 million, but 30% of supplies are delayed, per OK. PCPSR polls show 65% of Gazans blame Israel, 20% Hamas for the crisis. April 2008, failed ceasefire talks. In Cairo, April 2008, Egypt mediates a Hamas-Israel ceasefire, per Al Jazeera. Hamas offers a 6-month truce if Israel lifts the blockade, per Hamas statements. Israel demands an end to rocket fire 1,200 in 2008, per Shin Bet, and the release of IDF soldier Gilad Shalit, captured in 2006. Talks collapse, per Egyptian records, as Olmert insists no deal with terrorists, per Haaretz. Israel's blockade tightens. Fishing limits drop from 12 to 6 nautical miles. Per UNRWA, cutting fish catches by 60%. Gaza's 3,000 fishermen lose 70% of income, per OCA. Exports, once 1,000 trucks monthly, fall to 0. Per World Bank, crippling 5,000 businesses. Hamas's tunnels, now 300, smuggle $30 million in goods, per UN estimates, including weapons. In Ramallah, Abbas meets Blair, securing $200 million in EU aid, per EU reports, for West Bank infrastructure. He condemns Hamas, stating their rule brings misery, per PA transcripts. PCPSR polls show 55% of Palestinians want reconciliation, but 40% support Hamas's resistance. In Israel, 70% back the blockade, per Yediot Aeronaut. As 20 IDF raids kill 100 Palestinians, per Butslam, October 2008, a deepening crisis. By October 2008, Gaza's humanitarian crisis peaks. Power cuts hit 16 hours daily, per OCHA, affecting 1.2 million. Sewage systems fail, spilling 20,000 liters daily into the sea, per UNEP. Malnutrition affects 10% of children under 5, per UNICEF. UNRWA's $300 million aid budget supports 1.1 million, but 40% of food aid is delayed, per OCA. Hamas organizes 30,000-strong protests, per Al Jazeera, demanding open borders. Rocket fire reaches 1,500, per Shin Bet, killing 3 Israelis. Israel launches 50 airstrikes, killing 150 Palestinians, including 40 civilians, per Butslam. UN Security Council calls for calm, per Resolution 1850, but fails to enforce it. The U.S. provides $150 million to Israel's Iron Dome, per State Department, to counter rockets. In New York, Ban Ki-moon warns, Gaza's suffering is unsustainable, per UN transcripts. The EU pledges $100 million for Gaza, per EU reports, but Israel's restrictions block 80% of aid trucks. Hamas's tunnels, now 400, smuggle $50 million in goods, per Egyptian intelligence, sustaining 20,000 families. PCPSR polls show 60% of Gazans feel abandoned, with 45% supporting Hamas. December 2008. Prelude to war, On December 19, 2008, a 6-month Hamas-Israel truce, mediated by Egypt, expires, per Al Jazeera. Rocket fire surges to 200 in a week per Shin Bet, injuring 5 Israelis. Israel prepares Operation Cast Lead, deploying 10,000 troops per IDF logs. Olmert tells aides, Hamas must be stopped, per Haaretz. As 80% of Israelis support action, per Israel Democracy Institute polls. In Gaza, 50,000 protest the blockade, per Al Jazeera, as Haniya vows will resist, per Hamas media. Abbas in Ramallah tells Blair, Hamas's rockets provoke disaster, per PA memos. The UN warns of 1.5 million at risk, per OCA, with 90% of Gazans reliant on aid. PCPSR polls show 50% of Palestinians want peace talks, but 40% back Hamas's defiance. The blockades toll 85% poverty, 70% food insecurity, per World Bank fuels militancy. Hamas's tunnels, now 500, smuggle $70 million per UN estimates, including 1,000 rockets. Israel's airstrikes kill 200 Palestinians, including 60 civilians per Badslam, setting the stage for a devastating war, a siege's lasting scars. By December 2008, Gaza's blockade has transformed 1.5 million lives into a struggle for survival. Israel's restrictions, backed by Egypt and justified by 3,000 rockets per Shin Bet, choke Gaza's economy, with 90% of businesses shuttered, per World Bank. Hamas's rule, funded by $70 million in smuggled goods. Per UN estimates, sustains resistance, but deepens isolation. The humanitarian crisis 80% aid dependency, 16 oil power cuts, per UN RWA ignites global outrage. With 60% of Europeans calling the blockade illegal, per Pew polls. The Hamas divide, with Abba's West Bank receiving $600 million in aid, per EU reports, cements a fractured Palestine. As 2008 ends, Operation Cast Lead looms, promising more bloodshed in a land strangled by siege. Operation Cast Lead in escalation to 008-2009. A war ignited. December 2008, Gaza Strip, a fragile 6-month truce between Israel and Hamas collapses, as 3,000 rockets fired from Gaza in 2008, or Shin Bet, provoke Israel's deadliest military operation since 1967. Operation Cast Lead, launched on December 27, 2008, unleashes a 22-day assault, killing 1,400 Palestinians and 13 Israelis per Batslam. Gaza, already crippled by a blockade slashing imports by 80%, per World Bank, faces devastation amid a humanitarian crisis affecting 1.5 million residents. Hamas's defiance, Israel's security imperatives, and a fractured Palestinian Authority (PA) fuel a conflict that draws global scrutiny. This factual account, drawn from UN reports, Batslam Haaretz, Al Jazeera, PCPSR polls, and official records, details the war's causes, unfolding, and consequences, a pivotal escalation in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. December 2008, the truce collapses. In Gaza City, December 19, 2008, a 6-month Egypt-mediated ceasefire between Hamas and Israel expires, per Al Jazeera. Hamas, controlling Gaza since its 2007 takeover, fires 200 rockets in a week, injuring 5 Israelis, per Shin Bet. Israel, led by Prime Minister Ehud Olmert, prepares Operation Cast Lead, deploying 10,000 troops and 200 tanks along Gaza's border, per IDF logs. Olmert tells the cabinet, Hamas must pay for its aggression, per Haaretz. With 80% of Israelis supporting military action, per Israel Democracy Institute polls. Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh, addressing 20,000 in Gaza, declares, "We'll resist occupation," per Hamas media, citing the blockade's toll. 85% poverty, 70% food insecurity, per World Bank. PA President Mahmoud Abbas, in Ramallah, tells Quartet envoy Tony Blair, Hamas's rockets invite disaster, per PA memos. PCPSR polls show 50% of Palestinians want renewed talks, but 40% back Hamas's defiance. The UN warning of 1.5 million at risk, per OCA, urges restraint, but 500 smuggling tunnels sustain Hamas with $70 million in goods, per UN estimates. In Washington, the U.S. providing $2.7 billion in military aid. Per State Department records, backs Israel's right to self-defense. Egypt, sealing RAF with 2,000 troops per Egyptian records. Condemns rocket fire but criticizes Israel's blockade, per Al Jazeera. The stage is set for war. December 27, 2008. Operation Cast Lead begins. At 11:30 a.m., December 27, 2008, Israeli F-16s launch 100 airstrikes on Gaza, targeting Hamas's security compounds, per IDF logs. Within hours, 230 Palestinians are killed, including 100 civilians, per Batslam. Hamas's East Aldin al-Qassam brigades, 5,000 strong, fire 60 rockets, per Shin Bet, hitting Sderot and Ashkelon, injuring 10 Israelis. As in Gaza City, 50,000 flee to UNRWA shelters, per UN reports, as hospitals, serving 1.5 million. Are overwhelmed, with 70% medicine shortages, per WHO. Olmert addresses Israel, stating, "This protects our citizens." Per TV transcripts, as 75% of Israelis approve, per Yediot Aronot polls. Haniyeh, in a bunker, tells Al Jazeera, Israel's aggression will fail. Abbas, in Ramallah, condemns the operation as brutal, per PA statements, but urges Hamas to stop rockets. PCPSR polls show 55% of Palestinians oppose the war, with 40% supporting resistance. The UN Security Council meets urgently on December 28th, per UN records, but a US veto blocks a ceasefire resolution. The EU, providing $200 million to the PA, per EU reports, calls for proportionality. In Cairo, 10,000 protest Israel's actions, per Al Jazeera, while Egypt keeps RAF closed, citing security. January 3, 2009. Ground invasion. On January 3, 2009, Israel launches a ground offensive, with 9,000 IDF troops entering Gaza, per military logs. Tanks and infantry target Hamas's tunnels and rocket sites, per IDF statements, killing 300 Palestinians, including 100 civilians in a week, per Batslam. Hamas fires 200 rockets, per Shin Bet, killing 3 Israeli soldiers. In Jobelia camp, an IDF strike on a UN school kills 40 civilians, per UNRWA, sparking global outrage. In Gaza City, 100,000 lose electricity, per OCA, as Israel bombs the Seoul power plant. Sewage spills 30,000 liters daily into the sea, per UNEP. Hamas's tunnels. Now 600, smuggle $10 million in weapons, per Egyptian intelligence. Haniyeh tells supporters will never surrender, per Hamas media. 30,000 rally, per Al Jazeera. In Ramallah, Abbas meets Egypt's Hosni Mubarak, per PA records, demanding a ceasefire. Egypt proposes a truce on January 6th, per Al Jazeera, but Hamas demands an end to the blockade, while Israel insists on Shalat's release and rocket cessation, per IDF statements. Talks stall, per Egyptian records. PCPSR polls show 60% of Gazans want peace, but 35% back Hamas's fight. January 10th to 18th, 2009. The war's climax. By January 10th, 1,000 Palestinians are dead, including 400 civilians, per Batslam, and 5,000 injured, per WHO. Israel's use of white phosphorus, per Human Rights Watch, burns 20 civilians in densely packed Gaza City. Hamas fires 300 rockets, per Shin Bet, injuring 15 Israelis. The UN Security Council passes Resolution 1860 on January 8th, calling for a ceasefire, per UN records, but both sides ignore it. The US, providing $150 million for Iron Dome, per State Department, urges Israel to minimize civilian harm. In Europe, 100,000 protests in London, per BBC, decrying Israel's disproportionate force. PCPSR polls show 65% of Palestinians view the war as a massacre. On January 18th, Israel declares a unilateral ceasefire, per IDF statements, followed by Hamas. The war ends. With 1,400 Palestinians, 800 civilians, and 13 Israelis, 10 soldiers dead. Per Batslam. Gaza's damage, $2 billion, per World Bank, with 20,000 homes and 50 schools destroyed, per UNWA. January-March 2009, aftermath and investigations. In Gaza, 500,000 tons of rubble litter the streets, per OCHA. Reconstruction stalls as Israel bans cement imports, per UNWA. Hamas distributes $20 million in Iranian aid, per Egyptian intelligence, to 50,000 families. Rocket fire drops to 100 monthly, per Shin Bet, but Israel conducts 10 airstrikes, killing 20 per Batslam. PCPSR polls show Hamas's support at 40%, with 55% of Gazans demanding open borders. In Ramallah, Abbas secures $1 billion in donor pledges, per World Bank. But funds bypass Gaza. The UN's Goldstone report, released September 2009, accuses both Israel and Hamas of war crimes, citing civilian deaths and phosphorus use, per UN documents. Israel rejects it as biased, per Haaretz, while Hamas denies targeting civilians. The US opposes the report, per State Department. But 60% of Europeans support its findings, per Pew polls. In Cairo, Egypt mediates reconciliation talks, per Al Jazeera, but Abbas and Haniyeh fail to unite, per PA memos. The blockade continues, with 90% of Gazans reliant on UNWA aid, per OCHA. Poverty hits 85%, per World Bank. And child malnutrition rises 15%, per UNICEF. March-December 2009. A fragile stasis. By March 2009, Gaza's reconstruction lags, with only 10% of damaged homes rebuilt, per UNWA. Hamas's tunnels, 700 strong, smuggle $80 million in goods, per UN estimates, sustaining its rule. Rocket fire 500 in 2009, per Shin Bet prompts 20 IDF raids, killing 50 Palestinians, per Botslam. In Israel, Olmert's government falls, and Benjamin Netanyahu, elected in February 2009 with 65% of votes, per Knesset records, vows a hardline stance, per Haaretz. The quartet pledges $500 million for Gaza, per EU reports, but Israel's restrictions block 80% of aid trucks. In New York, Ban Ki-moon warns, Gaza's isolation breeds extremism, per UN transcripts. PCPSR polls show 50% of Palestinians want peace talks, but 45% support Hamas's resistance. The West Bank, under Abbas, received $600 million in aid, per World Bank, widening the PA's divide. A war's lasting echoes. Operation Cast Lead, costing 1,400 Palestinian and 13 Israeli lives. Per Batslam, leaves Gaza in ruins and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict at a stalemate. The blockade tightened since 2007, traps 1.5 million in poverty, with 90% aid-dependent, per UNRWA. Hamas's resilience, fueled by $80 million in smuggled funds, per UN estimates, cements its grip on Gaza. While Abbas's West Bank drifts further from reconciliation, the Goldstone report's war crimes allegations rejected by Israel and the US fuel global debate, with 65% of Europeans calling for accountability, per Pew polls. As 2009 ends, Gaza's scars and Hamas's defiance signal a cycle of conflict far from resolution, setting the stage for future wars.
From 2005 to 2009, Gaza's disengagement and Hamas's rise reshaped the struggle. Israel's withdrawal ended direct rule, but birthed a crippling blockade on 1.5 million lives. Hamas's election win and 2007 takeover split Palestinians, while Operation Cast Lead killed 1,400, deepening enmity. This chapter shows hope betrayed and resilience forged. See you in Chapter 10, where new wars and diplomatic twists await. Like, subscribe, and follow The Deep Chapter.